The highway stretched endlessly into the horizon, a two-lane ribbon of asphalt flanked by dark woods on either side. The moon hung low, casting an eerie silver glow over the road. Emma gripped the steering wheel tighter, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. 11:48 p.m. Too late to be driving, especially on this desolate stretch of highway. Her friend Jake snored softly in the passenger seat, his head leaning awkwardly against the window. They were halfway through a cross-country road trip, a spontaneous decision made to escape the monotony of their small-town lives. Tonight's destination was a cheap motel in a town neither of them could pronounce, still 2 hours away. Emma's eyes darted to the fuel gauge, nearly empty. She sighed. "Should have filled up at the last station," she muttered. Jake stirred but didn't wake. As if summoned by her thoughts, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. The vehicle, a rusted pickup truck, crept closer, its engine a guttural growl that reverberated in the quiet night. Emma felt a twinge of unease. The truck's headlights were almost blinding now, tailgating her for no apparent reason. She eased the car to the side to let it pass, but instead of overtaking, the truck slowed down and stayed behind her. Her heart began to pound. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached over and shook his shoulder. "Wake up," Jake groaned and rubbed his eyes. "What's wrong?" "Look behind us." He turned, squinting at the truck's glaring lights. "Maybe they're just messing around. Speed up a little. They'll get bored." Emma pressed the gas pedal. The car picked up speed, but so did the truck. It stayed unnervingly close, its headlights flickering as if mocking them. "This is insane," Emma said, her voice rising. "What do they want?" Jake grabbed his phone. "Let's call the cops." Before he could dial, the truck's horn blared, a deep, menacing sound that sent shivers down Emma's spine. She jumped, the car swerving slightly. The truck pulled into the opposite lane, accelerating as if to pass, but instead it drove parallel to them. Jake rolled down his window to yell at the driver, but when he leaned out, his words died in his throat. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What?" she asked, panic creeping in. "There's no one driving." Emma's stomach dropped. She glanced at the truck. Sure enough, the driver's seat was empty. The truck's windows were down, and inside, the cab was dark and hollow, as though the vehicle was an extension of the night itself. The truck swerved suddenly, ramming into their car. Emma screamed, struggling to control the wheel. Jake clutched the dashboard, his phone slipping from his hand. "We need to get off this road," Emma shouted. Up ahead, a narrow dirt path veered into the woods. Without thinking, she yanked the wheel, sending the car skidding onto the trail. The truck screeched to a halt behind them, its headlights extinguishing as if swallowed by the darkness. Emma didn't stop until the car was deep within the woods, hidden beneath a canopy of skeletal branches. She killed the engine, her hands trembling as she gripped the wheel. "Do you think we lost it?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. Emma didn't answer. She stared into the trees, half expecting the truck to emerge, its headlights cutting through the night. But nothing happened. The silence was deafening. Then came the knock. A soft, deliberate tap on the driver's side window. Emma froze. Jake's eyes widened, his face pale. "Don't look," he whispered. But Emma couldn't help herself. She turned slowly, her breath hitching. A man stood there, his face obscured by shadows. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, and his grin stretched unnaturally wide, teeth gleaming in the dim moonlight. His hand rested on the window, fingers long and gnarled, as though they belonged to something not entirely human. "Need some help?" the man asked, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. Emma shook her head, unable to speak. Jake reached for the lock button, but before he could press it, the man slammed his hand against the glass, cracking it. "Drive!" Jake yelled. Emma fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with sweat. The man's grin widened and he leaned closer, his breath fogging the window. "You can't run forever." The engine roared to life, and Emma floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the man disappearing into the shadows behind them. But as they sped down the trail, a chilling realization dawned on Emma. The dirt path was endless, looping back on itself like a sinister maze. No matter how far they drove, the man's voice echoed in the trees, always close, always whispering, "You can't escape the road."
Story number 2.
The road was a straight shot through miles of desert, empty and silent under the vast night sky. Carter, Maya, and Lucas had set out on a late-night drive, their old station wagon rattling against the stillness. They were college friends chasing adventure, seeking the thrill of the unknown. But the fun had faded hours ago, replaced by an eerie tension none of them wanted to admit. Maya leaned forward from the back seat, breaking the silence. "We haven't passed a single car in over an hour. Are we even going the right way?" Carter glanced at the GPS on his phone. The screen flickered, the blue route line dissolving into static. "It was working before," he muttered, smacking the side of the device. "No signal." "I told you we should have stopped in town," Lucas said, gripping the wheel tighter. "Now we're out here in the middle of nowhere." "It's fine," Carter said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll hit a town eventually." As if on cue, headlights appeared in the distance. The group collectively exhaled, relieved at the sign of another human presence. The lights grew closer, revealing an old sedan that was clearly worse for wear. The car slowed as it passed, the driver's face barely visible behind a foggy window. Carter caught a glimpse, a pale face, hollow eyes, and felt an inexplicable chill crawl up his spine. The sedan stopped abruptly ahead of them, idling in the middle of the road. "What are they doing?" Maya whispered, leaning forward. "Maybe they're lost too," Carter said, though his stomach tightened with unease. "Just go around them." Lucas nodded, steering the wagon to pass. As they drove by, Carter glanced out the window. The driver of the sedan was now outside, standing perfectly still, staring at them. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and empty, like he was looking through them, not at them. "Don't stop," Carter hissed, gripping Lucas's arm. "I wasn't planning to," Lucas replied, pressing the gas. The sedan disappeared into the distance behind them, swallowed by the darkness. The group fell silent, the unease thickening. Then the headlights appeared again. "They're back," Maya said, her voice trembling. Lucas glanced in the rearview mirror. The sedan was following, its headlights glaring like twin eyes. It accelerated, closing the distance between them. "This is bad," Lucas said, panic creeping into his voice. "Speed up," Carter urged. The wagon surged forward, the engine groaning in protest. But the sedan kept pace, its headlights now almost blinding. The group's fear turned to terror as the sedan swerved violently, attempting to ram their car. "Are they trying to kill us?" Maya screamed. The sedan struck the back of their car, sending it skidding. Lucas fought to regain control, the tires screeching against the asphalt. "Turn off!" Carter shouted, pointing to a narrow dirt road barely visible ahead. Lucas veered onto the dirt path, the car jostling violently over the uneven terrain. The sedan didn't follow. Its headlights vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. They drove in tense silence, the dark expanse of the desert pressing in on them. Maya's breath hitched. "Do you hear that?" The group fell silent, straining to listen. A low, rhythmic thumping echoed around them, like footsteps on hard ground. "It's just the engine," Lucas said, though his voice wavered. "No," Maya said, her eyes wide. "It's getting closer." The thumping grew louder, more deliberate, accompanied by a faint scraping sound. Carter turned to look out the rear window and froze. A figure was running after the car. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its limbs were elongated, bending unnaturally as it moved. Its face was featureless, except for a gaping black maw that stretched impossibly wide. "Faster!" Carter screamed. Lucas slammed the gas, but the figure didn't falter. It was gaining, its distorted body illuminated briefly by the moonlight. It let out a sound, a guttural, ear-splitting scream that seemed to shake the air around them. "Get out of here!" Maya shrieked, covering her ears. Lucas swerved the car down a steeper path, the figure falling out of sight. They didn't stop driving until the dirt road led them to a dilapidated gas station, its flickering neon sign a beacon of hope. They stumbled out of the car, trembling and pale. The station attendant looked up from behind the counter, his expression grim. "Lost, huh?" he said, his voice low. Something chased us," Carter stammered. "On the road." The attendant nodded slowly. "You came down Devil's Stretch. Folks don't travel that road at night, the ones that do." He trailed off, eyeing them warily. "What happens to them?" Maya whispered. The attendant's gaze darkened. "Some never make it back, and those that do, they're never the same." The group exchanged fearful glances, the weight of his words sinking in. Behind them, the station door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold night air. And from somewhere in the distance, the scream echoed again.
Story number 3.
The clock on the dashboard blinked 3:13 a.m. as Cassie, Eric, and Jenna sped down the fog-shrouded highway. Their road trip had been fun earlier in the day, music blasting, snacks scattered, and laughter filling the car. But now, under the oppressive weight of darkness, the mood had shifted. The road ahead was empty, save for their headlights cutting through the thick mist. Cassie sat in the driver's seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. Eric leaned against the window, half asleep, while Jenna scrolled aimlessly on her phone in the back seat. "How much longer?" Jenna asked, her voice breaking the silence. Cassie glanced at the GPS. "About 2 hours." Eric stirred. "Should we find a motel? Driving this late isn't a great idea." "There's nothing around," Cassie replied. "Just more road." As if to prove her point, a green highway sign emerged from the fog, its letters faded. "Black Hollow, 27 miles. Creepy name," like Jenna muttered, shoving her phone into her pocket. As they passed the sign, the car's radio crackled, a burst of static breaking through the silence. Cassie frowned and tapped the power button, but the static grew louder, distorted voices whispering beneath it. "Turn it off," Eric said, sitting up, his eyes wide. "I'm trying." Cassie snapped, twisting the knob. Finally, the radio went silent, leaving an unsettling emptiness in its wake. The fog thickened, swallowing the road ahead. Cassie slowed the car to a crawl, her heart pounding. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow flicker past the trees lining the road. "Did you see that?" she asked. "See what?" Jenna replied. "There was something, someone." Cassie began, but stopped as her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, her hair long and matted, her dress tattered and hanging in strips. Her head was bowed, obscuring her face. She stood completely still, as if waiting. "Holy," Eric started, but Cassie slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just feet away from the figure. "What the hell is she doing?" Jenna whispered. The woman didn't move. Cassie rolled down her window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" she called out. The woman's head snapped up. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were hollow voids. Her mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She let out an unearthly wail, a sound that pierced their ears and seemed to shake the car itself. "Drive!" Eric screamed. Cassie stomped on the gas. The woman's hands slammed onto the hood of the car as they sped forward, her nails screeching against the metal before she was thrown aside. Cassie didn't stop, her hands trembling as she gripped the wheel. The road twisted and turned, the fog growing denser with every mile. The GPS blinked out, its screen turning black. The clock on the dashboard froze at 3:13 a.m. "We're not on the map anymore," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "Where are we?" "I don't know," Cassie yelled, tears pricking her eyes. The car hit a pothole, jostling them violently. Ahead, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers. And then they saw it again. The woman. She stood at the side of the road, her hollow eyes fixed on the car. This time she was smiling. "She's back!" Jenna screamed. Cassie swerved, narrowly missing the woman as the car sped past. But the woman didn't fade into the distance. Instead, she appeared ahead of them again, closer this time. "How is she doing that?" Eric yelled. The car's engine began to sputter. Cassie slammed the gas pedal, but it was no use. The car slowed to a stop, the headlights flickering. No, Cassie muttered, turning the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to start. The woman appeared just ahead, stepping out of the fog. Her smile widened, her head tilting unnaturally to the side. "We need to run," Jenna shouted, fumbling with her seatbelt. "Into the woods?" Eric asked, his voice panicked. "Do we have a choice?" Cassie snapped. The three of them bolted from the car, plunging into the dark forest. Branches clawed at their clothes as they ran, their breaths ragged. Behind them, the woman's wail echoed, closer and closer. "She's following us," Jenna cried. Cassie tripped, landing hard on the ground. Eric and Jenna turned back to help her, but before they could, the wailing stopped. The forest fell silent. "What happened?" Eric whispered. A low laugh resonated through the trees, sending chills down their spines. They turned to see the woman standing just feet away, her form flickering like a glitch in a broken video. "You can't leave," she said, her voice a distorted whisper. "You're part of the hollow now." The last thing they heard was the sound of their own screams blending with the darkness.
Story number 4.
The storm had rolled in without warning, turning what was supposed to be a fun road trip into a nightmare. Samantha, Leo, and Tyler sat huddled in their SUV, rain hammering against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The GPS had stopped working hours ago, and they had been driving aimlessly through twisting back roads, looking for any sign of civilization. "Pull over," Samantha said, her voice tight with frustration. "We're just wasting gas." "I'm not stopping out here," Leo replied, his eyes darting to the shadowy woods lining both sides of the road. "This place is giving me bad vibes." We don't have a choice, Tyler said from the back seat. We're almost on empty. Leo sighed and reluctantly steered the car onto the shoulder, the tires crunching against gravel. The rain blurred the trees into dark, shapeless masses, and the only sound was the relentless drumming of water on the roof. Great, Samantha muttered. What now? We wait for the rain to let up, Leo said, though he didn't sound convinced. He turned off the engine, plunging the car into an eerie silence. As they sat there, Samantha noticed something in the rearview mirror, a faint light in the distance, growing brighter. Look, she said, pointing. A pair of headlights emerged from the storm, approaching slowly. Relief flooded through her. Finally, someone else on this god-forsaken road. The vehicle, a battered van, pulled up behind them, its high beams cutting through the rain. The van idled for a moment before the lights switched off. Should we ask for help? Tyler asked, his voice uncertain. Let's see what they do, Leo said, his hand hovering over the door handle. The three of them watched as the driver's door of the van creaked open. A man stepped out, his figure silhouetted by the faint interior light. He was tall, wearing a long coat that flapped in the wind. He stood motionless for a moment, staring at their car. Why isn't he coming over? Samantha whispered. The man reached into his coat and pulled out something long and thin. It gleamed faintly in the rain. A crowbar. Lock the doors, Leo hissed, slamming the button on his side. The sound of the locks clicking into place seemed deafening in the tense silence. The man took a step closer, his face obscured by the shadows. He raised the crowbar, tapping it lightly against his palm as if testing its weight. This isn't happening, Tyler muttered, shrinking into his seat. Maybe he's just trying to scare us, Samantha said, though her voice trembled. The man moved to the driver's side of their car, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He dragged the crowbar along the car's side, the metal screeching against the paint. Leo's breathing quickened. Start the car, Samantha shouted. Leo twisted the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, but didn't start. He tried again, his panic mounting as the car refused to come to life. The man stopped at the driver's window. Slowly, he raised the crowbar and tapped it against the glass. Leave us alone, Samantha screamed, pounding on the dashboard. The man tilted his head as if considering her plea. Then, with a sudden burst of violence, he swung the crowbar at the window. The glass held but cracked, spider-webbing under the force. Get out! Tyler shouted, scrambling for the back door. Where are you going? Samantha yelled, but Tyler was already outside, bolting into the woods. Stay together! Leo shouted, flinging open his door. He grabbed Samantha's arm, pulling her out as the man took another swing at the window. The two of them ran after Tyler, plunging into the forest. The rain made the ground slippery, and Samantha nearly fell several times as branches tore at her arms and face. Behind them, they heard the man's heavy footsteps, the crowbar clanging against the occasional tree trunk. Where's Tyler? Samantha gasped. I don't know, Leo said, his voice barely audible over the storm. They stumbled into a small clearing, the rain momentarily easing. In the center of the clearing was a cabin, its windows glowing faintly with warm yellow light. Go, Leo said, dragging Samantha toward it. They reached the porch and pounded on the door. Help! Please let us in! Leo shouted. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with kind eyes and a shawl draped over her shoulders. Come in, dears, she said, her voice soft and soothing. You'll catch your deaths out there. They hurried inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and herbs, and a fire crackled in the hearth. Thank you, Samantha said, her voice shaking. The woman smiled. It's no trouble at all. You're not the first to come running from the woods. What do you mean? Leo asked, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Before the woman could answer, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The front door shuddered on its hinges. He's here, Samantha whispered, backing away. The woman's expression darkened. He always finds his way, she said softly. The door burst open and the man stepped inside, his crowbar dripping with rain. But something about him had changed. His face was no longer obscured, it was gone, replaced by a blank, smooth surface. The woman turned to Samantha and Leo, her smile twisting into something sinister. You should have stayed on the road. The fire in the hearth flared suddenly, casting monstrous shadows on the walls, and then the light vanished, leaving only their screams to fill the darkness.
Story number 5.
The road wound like a black ribbon through the mountains, its edges swallowed by a dense, impenetrable fog. Angie, Mark, and Chloe had been driving for hours, the thrill of their weekend getaway slowly dissolving into exhaustion. It was Chloe who first spotted the figure, standing just off the side of the road, barely visible in the headlights. "Stop the car," she said suddenly, leaning forward. Mark, behind the wheel, frowned. "What? Why?" "There's someone out there," Chloe insisted, pointing. Angie squinted through the windshield. Sure enough, a man stood in the fog, his back to them. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and an old, tattered coat. He didn't move, even as the car slowed to a stop a few feet away. "Maybe he needs help," Chloe said. Mark shook his head. "Or maybe he's a lunatic waiting to kill us. Let's keep driving." "We can't just leave him here," Angie said, opening her door before Mark could protest. "Angie, don't," Mark began, but she was already stepping into the mist. "Sir?" Angie called out, approaching cautiously. The man didn't respond or turn around. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The silence was deafening. Angie hesitated, a chill creeping up her spine. The fog seemed thicker around him, swirling unnaturally at his feet. "Angie, get back in the car," Mark called, his voice tight with unease. Before she could respond, the man moved, his head tilted to the side, an unnatural motion like a puppet on a string. Slowly, he turned to face her. Angie froze. His face was wrong, his skin was pale and waxy like a mannequin's, and his eyes were black voids, endless and empty. His mouth stretched into a grin that didn't belong on a human face. "Run," the man whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping against pavement. Angie stumbled back, terror flooding her veins. She turned and sprinted to the car, slamming the door behind her. "Drive!" she screamed. Mark didn't hesitate, flooring the gas pedal. The car roared forward, leaving the man behind in the swirling mist. Chloe twisted in her seat to look out the back window. "He's gone," she said, her voice trembling. "He's just gone." The tension in the car was suffocating. No one spoke as they sped down the winding road. But a few miles later, Angie noticed something in the fog ahead. "Is that another person?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mark's hands tightened on the wheel. "No way. It can't be." But as they got closer, their worst fears were confirmed. Another figure stood by the side of the road. This time it was a woman, her head bowed, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She wore a dress that looked decades out of date, its fabric fluttering slightly in the still air. "Just keep going," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark veered around the figure, but as they passed, the woman's head snapped up, her face identical to the man's, smooth, pale, and empty, with those same black eyes and that terrible grin. She stepped onto the road directly behind them, and as Chloe turned to look, she screamed. The woman was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the fog, dozens of them, their distorted faces illuminated briefly in the red glow of the taillights. "They're following us," Chloe cried. Mark pressed harder on the gas, the car careening around a sharp turn. The fog thickened, swallowing the road ahead, and then the headlights illuminated something impossible. The same man from before stood in the middle of the road, his grin wider than ever. "Mark, stop!" Angie shouted. Mark slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car barreled toward the man and passed right through him. There was no impact, no sound, just the chilling sensation of icy air flooding. "What the hell is happening?" Mark yelled, his knuckles white on the wheel. The fog began to clear, revealing an old, rusted sign by the side of the road. It read, "Welcome to Hollow Point. Population 0. Zhao." "That wasn't there before," Angie whispered. The car sputtered suddenly, the engine dying. Mark frantically turned the key, but it wouldn't restart. The fog thickened again, wrapping around them like a living thing. And then they heard it. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The figures appeared out of the mist, surrounding the car. Their grins stretched impossibly wide, their black eyes reflecting the faint glow of the taillights. "Lock the doors," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Angie reached for the lock, but her hand froze as a face appeared at her window, inches from the glass. It was the man in the hat, his black eyes boring into hers. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice low and echoing with something inhuman. The last thing they saw was his grin, splitting his face in two as the fog swallowed the car whole.
Story number 6.
The gas station sat alone on the edge of the highway, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the mist that had rolled in with the night. Alex, Maya, and Ethan pulled into the empty lot, their old sedan rattling as it came to a stop. They were hours from the nearest town, and the low fuel gauge had left them with no choice but to stop. "I'll fill up," Alex said, stepping out and zipping up his jacket against the cold. You guys grab some snacks. Maya and Ethan exchanged a glance. The station didn't look inviting. Its windows were dark, and the only light came from a dim bulb over the door. But hunger and curiosity got the better of them. Together, they stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. Shelves lined with dusty, outdated products filled the space, and a single counter sat at the back. Behind it was an old man, his face gaunt and shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat. "Evening," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Hi," Maya replied, forcing a smile, "just grabbing a few things." Ethan wandered to the drink cooler, but when he opened the door, the light inside flickered and went out. The bottles inside were covered in grime, and the labels were faded to illegibility. "This place is creepy," Ethan muttered under his breath. Maya picked up a bag of chips and brought it to the counter. "How much?" she asked, but the old man didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something behind her. "Your friend's taking too long out there," he said suddenly. Maya turned toward the door, her stomach knotting. Alex hadn't come back yet. She stepped outside, calling his name. The gas pump stood empty, the nozzle still hanging from their car, but Alex was nowhere to be seen. "Alex?" she called again, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped out behind her. "Where'd he go?" The sound of a phone buzzing broke the silence. Maya pulled hers from her pocket. It was Alex's number. "Alex, where are you?" she asked, answering quickly. For a moment, there was silence on the other end, then a faint whisper. "Leave. Now." "What?" "Alex, where are you?" Maya's voice rose in panic. The line went dead. Ethan grabbed her arm. "Get in the car. We're not waiting." They jumped into the car, slamming the doors. Ethan turned the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. He twisted it again, harder this time, but all they heard was a sickening, grinding noise. "What's wrong with it?" Maya cried. Before Ethan could answer, the headlights flickered on by themselves, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. Standing just outside the beam of light was Alex. "There he is," Maya exclaimed, relief washing over her. She opened her door, but Ethan grabbed her wrist. "Wait," he said, his voice shaking. "Look at him." Alex stood unnaturally still, his head tilted slightly to the side. His clothes were soaked, and his arms hung limply at his sides. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed toward the station. Maya squinted through the windshield. The old man was standing in the doorway, watching them with a faint smile. Behind him, shadows moved, shapes that didn't belong to anything human. "What the hell is happening?" Maya whispered. Alex took a step closer. As he moved into the light, they saw his face. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty black sockets, and his mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Maya screamed, slamming her door shut. Ethan frantically tried the ignition again, and this time the car roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, its tires screeching as they sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, Maya saw the old man step fully into the light. He raised a hand, and the shadows behind him surged forward, spilling into the lot like a living tide. Alex stood at the center of it, his hollow eyes fixed on the fleeing car. The road stretched on endlessly as they drove, the mist growing thicker with every mile. The clock on the dashboard blinked 3:13 a.m., then froze. The headlights began to flicker. "What's wrong with the lights?" Ethan asked, his voice panicked. Maya didn't answer. She was staring out the window, her breath hitching. Figures were appearing in the fog, lining both sides of the road. Each one had the same hollow eyes and twisted grin as Alex. "They're everywhere," she whispered. The car sputtered, then died, coasting to a stop. Ethan slammed the steering wheel, swearing under his breath. The figures began to move, closing in on the car. Maya and Ethan locked eyes, their terror mirrored in each other's faces. The last thing they saw was Alex standing directly in front of the car, his grin impossibly wide as the fog swallowed them whole.
Story number 7.
The rain was relentless, turning the isolated highway into a glossy black mirror that reflected the dim glow of the moon. Emma and Jake had been driving for hours, the tension in the car as heavy as the storm outside. Their road trip had taken an unexpected detour when the main highway was closed, forcing them onto this desolate stretch of road. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Emma asked, her voice uneasy. Jake glanced at the GPS. "It's the only way. It says there's a town about 20 miles ahead." Emma sighed, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. The trees along the road seemed to stretch endlessly. their twisted branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Then they saw her. A figure stood on the side of the road, illuminated by their headlights. She was soaking wet, her long hair clinging to her pale face, and she wore a tattered white dress that seemed almost too pristine for someone stranded in the rain. "Do we stop?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated. "I don't know. What if it's a trap?" "She's alone, Jake. We can't just leave her out here." Jake pulled over reluctantly, rolling down the window just enough to speak. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't answer. She stepped closer, her movements unnaturally smooth. Up close, her features were unsettling. Her skin was unnaturally pale, her eyes a dull gray, and her lips were cracked and bloodless. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I need to get to the town." Emma opened her door, ignoring Jake's protests. "Come on. Get in. You'll catch your death out here." The woman slid into the back seat without a word. Water pooled on the upholstery, but Emma didn't care. She turned to face the stranger. "What's your name?" "Lila," the woman said softly, staring out the window. "Lila, where were you headed?" Jake asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "To the town," she replied, her voice hollow. Emma and Jake exchanged a glance but said nothing more. The car filled with an uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of the wipers and the rain. Emma tried to ignore the chill that seemed to emanate from Lila, as though the temperature had dropped the moment she got in. 10 minutes later, Lila spoke again. "You shouldn't be on this road." Emma turned to look at her, startled. "What do you mean?" "It's not safe," Lila said, her gray eyes meeting Emma's. "People disappear here." Jake tightened his grip on the wheel. "Disappear? What are you talking about?" Lila didn't answer. Instead, she began humming a strange, haunting melody. The sound sent a shiver down Emma's spine. She turned to Jake. "Maybe we should go back." "We can't," Jake said. "We're low on gas, and the town is closer than turning around." The car lurched suddenly, the engine sputtering. Jake cursed, pulling over to the side of the road. "What now?" "I'll check the engine," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. Jake stepped out into the rain, leaving Emma alone with Lila. The woman's humming grew louder, filling the small space. Emma felt her chest tighten, an inexplicable fear taking hold of her. "Lila, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lila turned to her, her face void of emotion. "He shouldn't have left the car." Before Emma could respond, the car's interior lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Outside, the rain seemed to grow louder, pounding against the roof like an angry fist. Emma strained to see Jake through the windshield, but he was gone. The flashlight lay abandoned on the ground, its beam casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement. "Jake?" Emma called, opening the door. The rain drenched her instantly, but she didn't care. "Jake, where are you?" Lila's voice came from behind her, calm and emotionless. "He's not coming back." Emma spun around to face her. "What did you do?" Lila tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "He belongs to them now." Emma's heart pounded. "To who?" The answer came not from Lila but from the woods. Shapes began to emerge from the trees, twisted, gaunt figures with glowing eyes and mouths stretched into grotesque grins. They moved unnaturally, their limbs bending at impossible angles as they closed in on the car. Emma backed away, her foot slipping on the wet ground. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting between Lila and the approaching figures. "What are they?" "They are the road's guardians," Lila said, stepping out of the car. "And you trespassed." Emma turned and ran, her screams swallowed by the storm. The last thing she saw before the figures overtook her was Lila standing in the rain, her gray eyes glowing faintly, her smile impossibly wide.